let me ask you something. Have you ever thought about all the stuff kids today will just never get to experience? I mean, we're talking about things that were like huge parts of everyday life back in the 80s, the kind of stuff that felt normal at the time, but now practically ancient history. Like, remember Saturday morning cartoons or actually having to go to a store to rent a movie? Yeah, that was a whole event. And waiting for your photos to get developed, that was patience on a whole new level. So, if you're ready to dive into some good old fashioned nostalgia, or maybe you're just curious about what life was like without all this instant tech, let's jump in. These are the things that made the 80s unforgettable. All right, so let's talk about Saturday mornings in the 80s. If you weren't there, it's kind of hard to explain just how big a deal they were. I mean, it was like a weekly ritual. You'd wake up early, yeah, willingly wake up early as a kid and plop down in front of the TV with your blanket, half asleep but totally excited. No school, no chores yet, just you, the couch, and a whole marathon of cartoons waiting to start. Now, here's the thing, these weren't just any cartoons. They were the best of the best, lined up back to back. You had Transformers, He-Man, Thundercats, the Smurfs. It was endless. Every channel had their own lineup, so you'd even plan out which shows to watch, like you were a little TV exec. And if you missed your favorite show, tough luck. It's gone till next Saturday. You were on their schedule, not yours. And the ads? Looking back, they were almost as good as the shows. Those toy commercials were like mini-movies. GI. Joe action figures blasting through jungles, Barbie cruising in her pink Corvette. It was epic. You'd sit there wide-eyed like, Mom, we need this, even though you knew you had no shot at getting half that stuff. The best part, your parents kind of left you alone. I mean, Saturday morning was your time. They'd be reading the paper, sipping coffee, or just, sleeping in a bit. It was this unwritten agreement. You got the TV, they got some peace. And the cherry on top, a bowl of sugary cereal that turned your milk all kinds of wild colors, like we're talking Fruit Loops, Cap'n Crunch, or Lucky Charms. Saturday mornings had their own flavor. And then by noon, just like that, it was over. The cartoons vanished, replaced by sports or news, and you knew the magic was done till next week. There was this weird, almost bittersweet feeling like, well, that was great. See you next Saturday. It sounds simple, right? But those few hours each week, they felt like the ultimate freedom, pure, kid-level happiness, and honestly, it's something that you really don't see today. All right, let's talk cassette tapes and mixtapes. I know sounds ancient, right? But these little plastic rectangles, they were everything. I mean, you didn't just listen to a tape, you invested in it. And mixtapes? Don't even get me started. That was practically an art form. So picture this. You'd have this pile of blank tapes all lined up ready to go. And when I say blank, I mean absolutely nothing on them. You had to fill them yourself. No add to playlist or drag and drop here. You had to wait by the radio, finger hovering over the record button, praying the DJ didn't talk over the song you wanted. And when you finally got that perfect track, man, you felt like you'd won the lottery. And mixtapes were personal, like really personal. If you made one for someone, that was a big deal. It wasn't just, here's some songs I like. It was, I spent 2 hours sitting on my bedroom floor thinking about every track to tell you exactly how I feel. Every song placement mattered. You'd start strong, throw in a few deep cuts, maybe sneak in that one sappy ballad. It was almost like musical Morse code. You're hoping they get the message without you actually having to say anything. But cassettes, they weren't exactly user-friendly. Tapes got tangled, warped, the works. You'd be halfway through a song and suddenly it's all distorted, warbling like some strange alien transmission. And don't even get me started on the pencil trick. Yeah, sometimes you had to take a pencil, stick it in the reel, and manually rewind the tape. It was like a little workout. But hey, it worked. And let's talk sound quality. Compared to today's digital stuff, yeah, tapes were pretty rough. You'd get that hissing sound in the background, and if you played it too much, forget it, your favorite track would sound like it was underwater. But honestly, we didn't care. That hiss, those quirks, they kind of gave tapes character. You'd put your headphones on, hit play, and zone out. It was your music in your own little world. So yeah, cassette tapes and mixtapes, they were clunky, a bit of a hassle, and a whole lot of fun. and somehow they made the music feel a little more yours. All right, so let's go back to the days of rotary phones and landlines. I know it sounds like the Stone Age now, but these things were everywhere. And if you've never seen one, well, just imagine a phone that was practically bolted to the wall. No texting, no caller ID, no scrolling through contacts, just a chunky, weighty receiver and a dial that you had to literally spin to call someone. Let me tell you, dialing a number on one of these things, not exactly a speedy process. You'd stick your finger in the little hole for each number, then spin it all the way around. And if there was a 9 in the number, forget it. That was like an extra 2 seconds just waiting for the dial to slowly click back. It was almost like the phone wanted you to think about your decision before actually calling someone. And speaking of calling, there was zero privacy. I mean, the phone was in the kitchen, or maybe the hallway, right? So if you wanted to chat with your friends, you'd have to stand there talking with your family, shuffling around, eavesdropping on every word. And if you liked someone, good luck. You'd have to keep it cool with your mom making dinner 3 feet away. Then there was the whole waiting for a call thing. If you were expecting someone to call, you had to be home. No cell phones, no taking calls on the go. You just sit there, sometimes staring at the phone, hoping it'd ring. And when it finally did, it was like a tiny jolt of excitement. If someone else picked up another phone in the house, you'd hear that dreaded click, and suddenly you had an audience. Privacy? Not even close. Oh, and those busy signals. Today, you can leave a voicemail or just text, but back then, if the line was busy, all you got was that steady buzz, buzz, buzz sound. You'd hang up, try again, hang up, try again. It was like phone tag, but with zero control. It's funny to think about it now, right? Rotary phones were a little clunky, maybe a bit of a hassle, but they had a charm too. Each call felt more deliberate, like it actually meant something. And that's probably something you just can't replicate today. All right, let's talk about video rental stores. If you never experienced it, let me just say, streaming has nothing on this. Going to a rental store was like this whole adventure. It wasn't just, picking a movie, it was an event. Friday night would roll around and suddenly your whole family would pile into the car, all excited to spend the next hour or so wandering through aisles of movies. The moment you walked in, you'd be hit with this smell, like popcorn and plastic cases. And of course, there were shelves everywhere, lined top to bottom with VHS covers. It was almost overwhelming in the best way. You'd walk past the new releases, checking to see if the latest action movie or rom-com was in stock. And let me tell you, if that one big movie you'd been waiting to see was all rented out, that was like a mini tragedy. You'd do this walk of shame back to the family, telling them it wasn't there. Then you'd all have to regroup, pick a backup, and hope for the best. Now the cover art, that's what really sold the movie. They had to grab your attention, right? The front cover had all the cool graphics, but if you turned it around, sometimes the description was just downright confusing. You'd be squinting like, wait, what's this actually about? And sometimes if you had no idea what you were picking, you just go with the coolest looking cover. And sometimes that really worked. And sometimes you ended up with some very strange movies. And the staff, oh man, you'd always have that one guy behind the counter who looked like he'd seen every movie ever. You'd bring up a VHS to rent, and he'd raise an eyebrow, either nodding in approval or giving you that look like, you sure about this one? He was practically the human Rotten Tomatoes before Rotten Tomatoes. Then, of course, the sacred ritual of bringing the tapes home. You'd get the movie all set up, everyone gathered around the TV, and then, and this was the best part, there'd be a little rewind from whoever rented it last. Sometimes you'd even get the FBI warning at the beginning, which, for some reason, always felt kind of exciting. You knew you were about to watch something official, and when you were done, you had to remember to rewind it before bringing it back. That was a big deal. No one wanted to be the person who returned an unrewound tape. Be kind, rewind, right? Plus, there were late fees to worry about, so you'd make sure to get that thing back on time. It was a whole experience, and somehow it made watching a movie feel special, like you'd really put effort into the whole thing. So, yeah, video rental stores weren't perfect, but they had this magic, this whole process that just made movie night feel well, like a real event. And I don't know, maybe there was something kind of cool about that. So let's talk about analog TVs and antennas. Now, if you've never had to deal with one of these, consider yourself lucky. Imagine this huge boxy TV, no flat screens, no sleek designs, just a giant chunk of technology that weighed about as much as a small car. And if you wanted to watch anything, you had to adjust the antenna, or as we called them, the rabbit ears. Sounds easy, right? Nope. These antennas were like magic wands, except they only sometimes worked. You'd twist them in all kinds of weird directions, one ear up, one ear down, maybe lean it against the wall, and suddenly you'd get a clear picture. Or sometimes not, and just when you thought you had it perfect, the picture would go fuzzy and you'd be right back to square one. Honestly, it was like this little game of chance every time you turned on the TV. And the channels, let me tell you, we didn't have hundreds of channels. Oh no, you had maybe a dozen, give or take. And if you were lucky, they came in sort of clear. But you'd find yourself fine-tuning the antenna every few minutes just to catch that one show you'd been waiting all week for. And of course, someone always had to stand near the TV, holding the antenna to keep the picture clear. You'd be yelling from across the room like, "Don't move, just stand there." Yeah, it was a real team effort. And if you turned the TV on too late at night, you'd get the test pattern. Just this weird grid with a high-pitched tone that would stay there for hours, like the TV was saying, "Nope, go to bed." And once in a while, you'd get that rainbow-colored screen with a message saying, "This station has concluded its broadcast day." Just like that, TV was done for the night. No 24-hour programming, no on-demand. You'd go to bed knowing you'd have to wait until the morning for any chance at entertainment. It's funny though, looking back, all that hassle was just normal. You got used to it, even if it was frustrating. Somehow that static, that finicky antenna, it all added this little charm to watching TV. It made it feel, I don't know, a little more earned, I guess. Let's go back to arcades as hangouts. If you've never been to one in the 80s or 90s, well, it was a whole scene. You'd walk in and it was just this sensory overload, flashing lights everywhere, the sound of coins clinking, and oh man, the music. It was like stepping into a world where everything was just way cooler. And it wasn't just about the games, although they were obviously the main attraction. You had your Pac-Man, your Galaga, Street Fighter. All these classics lined up in a row. Each one had its own sound effects, so you'd hear like a mix of explosions, beeps, and cheers all blending together. And, you know, every machine had a bit of a crowd around it. If someone was really good at a game, people would just watch like it was a sporting event. You'd hear these little gasps and cheers, and there was that one person yelling advice over your shoulder. It was a whole vibe. But here's where it got really fun. The high score board. Getting your initials on that board, that was like instant fame. You'd play for hours, losing quarters left and right just to see your three little initials on that screen. And if you knocked someone off the top, oh, it was glorious. But you also knew deep down that they'd probably be back to take it from you the next day. And arcades weren't just for playing. They were hangouts. You'd meet up with friends, maybe even make a few new ones. It was kind of like an unspoken rule. If you were at the arcade, you were all in this together. Whether you were actually playing or just watching, there was this sense of camaraderie, you know? You'd swap tips, share snacks, and sometimes even share tokens if someone ran out. There was also that one kid who'd just linger around, no money, but always there. Sometimes you'd feel bad and toss him a quarter, let him have a go. And the snacks? Greasy pizza slices, neon-colored slushies, and candy that probably hadn't seen a fresh batch since the start of the decade. It was pretty much the best diet ever if you were 12. Leaving the arcade was the hardest part. You'd always tell yourself just one more game, and suddenly an hour's gone by. And your pockets? Empty. You'd walk out broke, probably a little dizzy, and already planning when you'd be back to try again for that high score. Looking back, the whole thing was like a rite of passage. Arcades weren't just about games. They were this whole social world where you learned about winning, losing, and, well, patience. Let's talk about waiting for film to be developed. If you're used to snapping a pic and seeing it instantly, this might sound downright painful. But back then, taking photos was a commitment. You'd have your camera load in the film, and you only had so many shots, maybe 24 or 36 if you were feeling fancy. So every click was like this little decision. Is this moment really worth it? And then came the suspense. Once you'd used up the roll, you couldn't just see the pictures right away. No way. You'd drop it off at the photo shop, hand over your little film canister, and they'd give you a slip with a pickup date, usually a week. And let me tell you, that week felt like forever. You'd start imagining all the shots you took, wondering if they actually came out the way you hoped, or if they came out at all. Then finally, the pickup day would roll around, and you'd head to the store feeling this weird mix of excitement and dread. They'd hand you an envelope full of glossy prints, and the anticipation was almost electric. You'd pull out the stack, holding your breath as you flipped through each one. And yeah, some were gems. Perfectly timed smiles, sunsets you actually managed to capture, but some blurry blobs or random shots of your thumb. Maybe someone blinked or the whole thing came out too dark. And those, they were stuck with you forever. But even with the duds, there was something kind of magical about it. Seeing those memories for the first time, knowing you couldn't just retake them, it made the good ones feel extra special. There was a realness to it. Every photo had a story, whether it was the one you meant to take or just, well, a happy accident. Waiting for film was this, little exercise in patience, a reminder that not everything had to be instant. And looking back, maybe that was part of the fun. So, let's go back to the school book fair catalogs. You remember those? Twice a year, maybe, you'd get this thin little catalog handed out at school, and it was like gold. Just flipping through it felt like stepping into another world. Page after page, packed with colorful covers, pictures of adventure stories, mysteries, maybe even a joke book or two. It was the kind of excitement that only happened at school, like once in a blue moon. Now, these catalogs, they weren't just about books. No, there were pencils with like your favorite character on them, erasers shaped like animals, maybe even those little squishy keychains. And you'd go through the whole catalog, marking down everything you wanted, knowing full well you probably weren't going to get most of it. But you dreamed big anyway. I'd circle 5, 6 books, throw in a couple of bookmarks, maybe a poster if I was feeling bold. And then, finally, the book fair would arrive. You'd walk in and it was like this mini bookstore right in your school's library. Tables covered with stacks of books, all the ones you'd seen in the catalog, and maybe even a few you hadn't. And the best part? You had a little budget. Maybe $5 your parents gave you, or money you'd saved from chores. So then came the real decision time, figuring out what you could actually get with what you had. And the books you ended up with, they were like treasure. You'd bring them home, sit down, and just dive in. Reading was different back then. You know, it wasn't just about the story, it was about the whole process, the anticipation, the choosing, finally getting your hands on the book. And when you got a good one, you'd read that thing to pieces. Thinking back, those catalogs weren't just about buying books. They were this little spark that made reading feel like an event. And somehow, it just made you love those stories a little bit more. So let's talk about handwritten letters and pen pals. This was like the way to keep in touch, especially with someone far away. No instant messaging, no quick emails. It was, personal. You'd sit down, grab a piece of paper, maybe even some fancy stationery if you were feeling extra, and start writing. And it wasn't just about what you were saying, it was how you were saying it. Every sentence, every little doodle in the margins, it all felt like a part of you going out on the page. And with pen pals, that was a whole adventure on its own. Sometimes you'd get paired up with someone from another state or even another country. You'd share little details about your life, things that felt big to you, but probably pretty normal to someone else. Hey, here's what I did over the weekend. Or, have you ever tried this? And then you'd wait. And I mean really wait. Weeks, sometimes even longer, to hear back. When a letter finally arrived, though, that was like hitting the jackpot. You'd open the mailbox, see an envelope with your name on it, and just pause, savor it. Sometimes you'd even save it for the perfect moment, like when you could read it without interruptions. You'd go somewhere quiet, maybe your room or a cozy spot outside, and just dive into their words, and it felt somehow like they were right there with you, chatting about their favorite movie or that funny thing their dog did. And let's not forget, the best pen pals always included a little something extra. A pressed flower, a tiny drawing, maybe a postcard from their hometown. It was this tiny surprise that made opening the envelope even better. And you'd start thinking of what you could send next time. A small charm, a newspaper clipping, or maybe just a quirky joke to make them laugh. Letters, they had a weight to them. You couldn't just delete or unsend. What you wrote was, well, set in ink. It made every word count a little more. And those letters, they lasted. You'd stack them in a shoebox, maybe tie them up with a ribbon, and years later, you'd pull them out and read them again, like a little time capsule of all those thoughts and stories. There was something about letters and pen pals, about sharing these pieces of your life with someone miles away, that made every exchange feel meaningful. It was this, I don't know, kind of magic that's hard to find in a text message. Let's talk about the thrill of new technology back in the day. I mean, now sure, we get a new phone every year or a laptop here and there, but it's not the same. Back then, when something new came out, it was like an event. People were genuinely excited in a way that's hard to describe now. Take the VCR, for example. This thing came along and changed everything. Suddenly, you could watch movies at home. No more rushing to the theater, no more waiting for your favorite film to maybe, hopefully, come back to the big screen someday. You could go to a store, rent a tape, and watch it in your living room, in your pajamas if you wanted. That felt like the future. And when the VCR had a remote control, oh man, you were living large. Never mind that you had to point it right at the TV and practically touch the screen to get it to work. It was still magic. Then there was the Walkman, a tape player that you could carry around. You weren't tied to your stereo at home anymore. You could take your music wherever you went, block out the world with your headphones, and just tune in to your own soundtrack. It was freedom in a way. People would pop on their Walkman and suddenly they were in their own music video, walking down the street like they were the star of the show. And cordless phones? Game changer. You didn't have to stretch the phone cord across 3 rooms anymore just to get a little privacy. You could wander around, go to the other room, maybe even step outside, all while talking to your best friend. And yeah, maybe the call quality wasn't perfect and the thing was like carrying a brick around, but still, no wires. It felt revolutionary. The best part? People actually gathered around for these things. The whole family would sit down, ready to learn how this amazing new gadget worked. Instructions were read, buttons were pressed, and usually there was a lot of trial and error. And the first time you got it working, everyone would just stand there, kind of in awe, like they were witnessing history. Technology then had this sense of wonder, like each new device was a little glimpse into the future. It wasn't just about what the gadget could do, it was the idea of what might come next. So, there you have it, a little trip back to when new tech actually felt like magic, when we had no idea what would come next, but couldn't wait to find out. It's funny to think how each new gadget, each little upgrade, felt like opening the door to the future. If you love this kind of stuff, these small slices of the past that somehow still feel close, then stick around, hit that subscribe button, join us here at Vintageverse. We've got plenty more to explore, from the quirks of old school gadgets to the weird and wonderful trends that made each era its own. So what do you say? Let's keep going back, one story at a time. You'll be surprised how much more there is to remember, or maybe even rediscover.